Hello. The only reason we are delayed a couple of minutes afternoon is to be able to say good afternoon. And thank you for coming. Today's event is the last of 6 events in the Research Without Borders series for the 2010-2011 academic year. It is sponsored by the Scholarly Communication Program, the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, the Center for the Critical Analysis of Social Difference, and the Society of Fellows in the Humanities. I am going to introduce all 3 speakers, each will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we will have time for discussion and questions from the audience. I would ask you to hold your questions until then, until the end, and please bear in mind that we are videotaping. You see the cameras and the spotlights and everything else. We are videotaping the event, so if you have a question for our panel, please, there is a microphone in the middle, so at the end, for the questions, use it, because like that we will be able to record also your questions. So I'm going to introduce the speakers. First one will be Daniel J. Cohen, who is an associate professor of history and the director of the Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. He's the author of Equations from God, Pure Mathematics and Victorian Faith by Johns Hopkins University Press, and co-author with Roy Rosenzweig of Digital History, a guide to gathering, preserving, and presenting the past on the web by UPenn Press. His next book, The Ivory Tower and the Open Web, is forthcoming from the University of Michigan Press. He is an inaugural recipient of the American Council of Learned Societies Digital Innovation Fellowship. At the Center for History and New Media, he has directed projects ranging from digital collections, September 11 Digital Archive, to scholarly software, one that we actually use very much, Zotero. Our second speaker will be Federica Frabetti, who is senior lecturer in the Communication, Media and Culture program at Oxford Brookes University in the United Kingdom. She has a diverse professional and academic background in the humanities and ICT, and has worked for a decade as a software engineer in telecommunications companies, although she studied lettere classiche, and she's a classicist by training. She has published numerous articles on the cultural history of technology, digital media and software studies, cultural theory, and gender and queer theory. She is an editor and translator of the Judith Halberstam Reader in Italian, and is currently completing a monograph titled Technology Made Legible, A Cultural History of Software. She is also the editor of the special issue of the journal Culture Machine entitled The Digital Humanities Beyond Computing. And then our third speaker today will be Dino Buzzetti, who has been teaching until lately medieval philosophy at the University of Bologna. He's published essays on medieval logic and metaphysics, which is all very digital-like. We remember those beautiful books in which you were taught to compute with your fingers, which is very digital. And the history of logic in general. He has also taught document representation and processing in the Faculty of Preservation of the Cultural Heritage in Ravenna, and given humanities computing courses to philosophy students. He has published on digital editions of manuscript texts and digital text representation, and he is a member of the Executive Committee of the Association for Literary and Linguistic Computing. Please join me welcoming our 3 speakers. Thank you for coming. And I think, Professor Cohen, you can start.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction. I want to thank Catherine Pope for the invitation, and it's really nice to be here. I think all 3 of the speakers can probably attest to the fact that each year the audiences get larger and larger. And so I think there is something going on, and I'm intrigued by the greater interest for this field that's probably been around for many decades, but seems to be really flourishing in 2011. we each only have about 20 minutes. I'm going to really try to stick to it because I think it'll be a lot more fun to have a conversation. But I just wanted to start with a brief discussion of what just happened a couple of weeks ago. There was the Day of Digital Humanities. And each year for the last 3 years, the University of Alberta has organized this international day where scores, actually I think this year it was hundreds of digital humanists, if we can use that term, record what they're doing all day, sort of a daily log of what they're doing. And this year, as in past years, the organizers also asked the participants to answer this question: how would you define the digital humanities? I think the best answer to this question came from Oxford's Lou Bernard, who recently retired from digital humanities after 35 years in the field. And when asked how he would define digital humanities, Lou replied, with extreme reluctance. And I think you can see, actually, I've done a little bit of text mining here, that what this means, digital humanities, which I like to use the singular, digital humanities, not the digital humanities. This is just a text mining. They've asked us each year of the words that come up, the most popular words that come up. I'm going to quickly go through them, but I'll let you discern whether there are changes, and then I'll tell you mine. Here's 2010. And 2011, this is just a word cloud of the most frequently occurring terms. I think if you look at it really carefully, and unfortunately some of it's faded out here in the screen, the words that have gone down are text, computing, and data. And the words that have gone up are words like media and tools. And sadly, although I can attest to this as director of a large digital humanities center, the most exponentially growing word is work, which is absolutely the case. If you work at a digital humanities center, you are working a lot of the time. There's so much to do. Also, another word that's come up is just DH, the abbreviation, which suggests a certain kind of familiarity and with the term, and I think abbreviations are important. This is really a moving target, and what I want to suggest today is just very briefly is several areas where digital humanities is working, is having an effect, and provide a few examples, largely from the Center for History and New Media, but also from some other places as well, and I'd be happy to elaborate on any of these when we get to the discussion period. So I was asked this question as well as a participant in the Day of Digital Humanities. What digital humanities means, and this was my answer in one sentence. I wrote it out, I think, in about 30 seconds. So it's fairly hasty, but I think it's not too bad. Digital humanities is the use of digital media and technology to advance the full range of thought and practice in the humanities, from the creation of scholarly resources to research on those resources, to the communication of results to colleagues and students. Let me go through each one of these. Let's talk about resources first. I mean, we've always accepted resources. I think actually we've taken them too much for granted. We look at the library and we think it's just something that's always exists, that doesn't have a lot of, it's a repository. It doesn't have a lot of intellectual work put into it. But of course there's a tremendous amount of intellectual work that's gone into the creation of the library. Things like finding aids and metadata and change over time, the way collections are created. And I think digital humanities is bringing to light the fact that these things, these entities, are actually more than just repositories for objects. They actually are entities that provide services and authorities, and they are now in a digital age also being blended with other collections. So, it's very rare for a scholar in today, as in the past, to do an entire work based on a single collection. Yes, there are people who study pre-Socratic philosophy that can be contained in a very small volume, and that might be a singular kind of research. But most people blend together resources from a variety of different places. And so in this age, in a digital age, it's ever more clear that libraries are connected, that they're interrelated, and so I think collections and digital collections have a special way of blending, and that's what the internet does really well, blending together decentralized resources. I've worked on the history of mathematics, and there's a terrific distributed collection of mathematical monographs, historical mathematical monographs that was put together by several universities you can search across this federated collection. It exists only in cyberspace, but it provides an important new research tool. So rather than going to each library's website, I'm now searching across them. And this provides new ways of discerning material I'd like to use and research on further. There are lots of fancy acronyms that digital humanities scholars use now, things like APIs, application programming interfaces, URIs, uniform resource indicators, things like this that sound really technical, but basically provide the connective tissue of the web, ways for software to connect up different pieces, different collections, ways for, in the case of URIs, for instance, the Library of Congress has a digital authority list where you can actually specify an address for instance, the allegory of Plato's cave. There's actually a digital insignia that, let's say if you wrote a blog post, you could tag it with the Library of Congress's number for that entity and then connect it up to other blog posts that are on Plato's allegory of the cave, regardless of whether those actual keywords exist in the blog post. So there are these very important authority files that, that scholars and librarians and archivists are working on. Librarians also become the hosts for corpora, very large collections that can be mined. I like to call them slobs, scholarly large objects. So things like all Victorian novels, for instance, would fall into the slob category. And that's something entirely new, actually, that we actually have access now to a corpus that is all Victorian novels, not just the canon, the ones that everyone reads, but actually all of them. And we can search through all of them in 2011. So there are these resources, and they are changing in nature. And I think this is one point I would make about the digital humanities is that it provides a unique opportunity now for scholars to collaborate very closely with librarians and others who hold digital collections in the shaping of those collections so that they may be optimal for new kinds of research. In addition to the transformation of traditional resources and the importance of those resources, there are also new collections. We host something called the Papers of the War Department that could only exist online. Papers of the War Department is essentially the first 15 years of American history. There was just the War Department and the Post Office in the 18th century in the United States. And this archive, which is about 50,000 letters, people like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Jefferson, the archive actually burned down in 1800. And starting in the late 70s, a very enterprising professor and his graduate students started going around the United States and finding the clerical copies of all the letters, because all letters had 2 copies. You'd send one and keep one for your records. And now they started to collect that first through Xerox copies, then eventually through digital scans. And we've now aggregated this at CHNM and added significant amounts of metadata so that for the first time, for instance, scholars of, let's say, the Second Amendment, if you're a legal scholar, you can, for the first time, go to the Papers of the War Department site and do research on who actually had guns in the 1780s and 90s. Who ordered them? Where did they send them? Did they send them to individuals or militia? This is the first time, because of this digital recreation, that we can actually search across the entire collection. There are, of course, born digital collections now. We have to get much more savvy than we currently are about how we save current history for future researchers. So one project that we've been involved in with the American Social History Project here in New York is the September 11th Digital Archive, which collected about 150,000 born digital objects from about 30,000 people. And this is a really unique archive, fully searchable. So it's very different than something like, the gold standard of, let's say, oral history here at Columbia, where they took 300 very in-depth interactive interviews as part of the oral history program after 9/11. Well, we have 100 times that. It's lesser in some sense, but the quantity has a quality all its own, and the fact that you can search through these things is very important, as I'll talk about in just a second. But we have to save these things now because they disappear from hard drives, from iPhones, from digital objects. We've also been building digital platforms for collections. So Omeka, is our platform to mount digital collections and exhibits, and it's built from the ground up to enable new forms of digital research. For instance, it's very easy to plug in a map and visualize a collection on a map. So things like that are very important, creating software that enables scholarship at the collection level. Research is probably what most people are hearing about, and I think this New York Times series and the launch of Culturomics, I guess is the correct pronunciation, that came out in the late fall, which really was what many people have been doing for a lot of times, of text mining large collections. In this case, n-grams, which are units of text. A unigram, a 1 gram is one word, all the way up to 5 grams actually in the Google corpus that they released and that we're also working on. This has been around for a while, but a lot of people are talking about it. But it is, and it is, something that's very interesting to use, but also needs to be, I think, studied in depth. It certainly represents a move from anecdotal history, from the selection by a scholar of a few texts that seem representative of something that happened in history, to overall trends. So, I've looked very closely in prior work, in more traditional analog work, at the Victorian crisis of faith. You can take the Google n-gram corpus and just look at, actually we have a grant from Google right now, so we also have actually the titles of books in addition to the n-grams. This is just the number of books that contain the word Christian in their title over the century. And you can really see the rather shocking loss of religious literature in the late Victorian era. If you want to look at more graphs like this, you can go to victorianbooks.org, our website on that, where we're looking at using text mining for these purposes. We're also looking at, we have a project with the Old Bailey online in England, which has put online the criminal records of the Central Court of London, over 100,000 court cases. And one of the things we're really interested in is actually tracing female agency, actually, in the 19th century. Here's just one chart. I don't have time to go into a great deal of depth, but what we are noticing is that women felt considerably more a lot more latitude to, for instance, take an extra husband in the late 19th century. And actually, when we then went down from the aerial view of these charts to the actual court cases, what you can see is that they often received much more of a slap on the wrist than significant punishment as they did earlier in the 19th century, because the court started to realize that the husbands were off in India or other places and doing things there, and so it was okay for the wives to take that on as well. So you can find these trends and then go from, again, the bird's eye view down to a close reading. And that is a point I want to make, is that I think when people look at these charts, they assume that, here comes Dan, to destroy all that is good in the humanities with a chart. And, that's just not the case. There's obviously ways where you can do prospecting sorts of research on large collections and then drop down and find things of interest. We're just going to have to do that. The example I like to use is if you're a presidential historian and you're working on Bill Clinton's White House, which is right after the shift to email memos, right, in the White House. You've gone from, for instance, the Johnson administration's 40,000 handwritten memos to 40 million email memos. So you have to be a digital scholar. How are you going? You can't sit down and read 40 million emails like Robert Caro, memos like Robert Caro did. You can't do that. That is not a conceivable project. So you will have to learn about information retrieval techniques, even if at that point you're just finding things that you then want to read more carefully. The chart doesn't necessarily need to replace close reading. Of course, there is the potential for maps and mapping. This is completely washed out, but it's a beautiful map that I will be happy to share with you in person later on. This is a map that we've extracted from the 9/11 collection, in which we've shown that there is absolutely no overlap between the people who prayed on 9/11 and the people who were watching CNN. You'll have to look at that more carefully later on. Okay. So, and then we write software that organizes things like Zotero, which I've heard has a big following here at Columbia University. And just the fact of organizing digital materials is an important part, I think, of digital humanities. Zotero takes the philosophy of Zotero is that the web is heterogeneous. It has lots of different kinds of collections. No one is doing research on a particular collection. And so it uses some semantic web principles to extract scholarly objects like monographs, letters, articles, books, videos from the web, and allows you to combine them in one collection, and then has a series of ways to begin to search through them, to sort them. I think communication and scholarly communication is underrated as an area in digital humanities. I think there's a lot that can be done in the way that once we have results, we communicate those results to other scholars, or in fact work on collaboratively new kinds of results. I'm sure you know that there's a terrific number of scholarly blogs out there on the web. They increase daily. I tell graduate students the best thing they can do is start a blog. It gives you an outlet for your scholarship on the web. It brands you. It shows you as someone working deeply in your field. There's no reason, again, it doesn't replace traditional publication or peer review, but it is an important outlet. And people who have started blogs will find that they get a very large audience very quickly, and it becomes a platform for them. In fact, I prefer publishing to my blog to pretty much anywhere else because I know that I can have a certain level of interaction with my audience. I reach an interdisciplinary audience, which is something that scholarly journals don't do because they're so pigeonholed and they reach, their subscriber base. My blog, I like the fact that it reaches technologists, it reaches humanists, it reaches librarians and archivists and museum professionals and people in many fields beyond history. And that is very important to me. I've met people through the blog that I wouldn't have collaborated with otherwise. There are entities that are group blog-ish, the New Everyday, which is at Media Commons, that tries to take this form of what they call a middle state publishing. So publishing that might be 1,000 or 2,000 words, right? Which wouldn't fit into a normal academic journal that wants a 6,000 to 10,000 word essay. And also can involve multimedia, right, of course, on the web in a way that print can't. So there are new genres emerging every day. I run a site called Digital Humanities Now that takes advantage of the aggregation and curation that's possible on the web. So it ingests all of the links that people are sharing in the digital humanities community, hundreds of people, and synthesizes those and plucks one or two important articles or project launches or news from the digital humanities community every day, digitalhumanities.org. I think also social media use will be something that we'll have to get used to. I've done several experiments in this, I guess stunt lecturing, you might call it, but this is one in the lower right where I put up a little archaeological find from the Victorian era. I gave a lecture where I had a very large audience and actually put it into my Twitter stream, just a link to this object with very little explanation. It was found in Illinois. Tell me what it is. And within 9 minutes, my Twitter followers identified exactly what it was and had all kinds of metadata about it, the use of it in ceremonial purposes. So again, I think that's something that is, obviously speed isn't everything in humanities scholarship, but I think that there's something about aggregate knowledge that without being all trendy and, Malcolm Gladwell-esque, I think there is something that is useful about the fact that we are connecting up through social media, and I think that will be important to scholars through digital humanities. Of course, all of these things will trickle down to the classroom. And at George Mason, I'm proud of the fact that we have, for a decade, been teaching all of our graduate students digital technology and media, how to use it, everything from creating a website to now how to do digital research, digital scholarship. And I just think this, just as in prior eras where you had to learn paleography, for instance, you will have to learn these techniques. They will be part of the scholarly toolkit. Final thing I want to say, since I'm out of time, is just this basic fact. I believe there's no such thing as armchair digital humanities. I think, and I hope our other speakers, and we could talk about this, I know this is true for Dino, but we've all come to this, actually. I think we all have very traditional training, but it is in the act of, for instance, producing a collection or encoding something or programming a piece of software that we've come to, I think, realize a lot about the medium, the way it works. And I think without actually doing it, when I hear, for instance, colleagues disparage blogging without ever having tried it, they just don't realize what can be done in the medium. Twitter is very deceptive. It's so easy to disparage it. 140 characters, how could anything scholarly happen? But there are professors on Twitter, for instance, Jay Rosen, the journalism professor at NYU, who basically runs an ongoing, as he calls it, a sort of flying seminar, I think, on his Twitter feed, where he points to things of interest, he makes criticisms if he needs to, he links to a longer blog post, and he has become essential reading, I think, for journalists. It's the reason he has 50,000 followers on Twitter. But you don't realize that, I think, until you actually engage the technology. So that's where I'll leave it. I think there's a lot to be done. I think it's a tremendously exciting field with, as I'm pointing out, many different realms of collections, of digital scholarship, of communication, of pedagogy, all of which need more people to try these things out. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Federica Frabetti, and I teach at Oxford Brookes University in the United Kingdom. Let me begin by thanking Jesus Rodriguez Velasco for such a generous introduction, and I also want to thank the Scholarly Communication Program at Columbia University for giving me the opportunity to take part in this panel on digital humanities, and Catherine Pope, of course, for organizing my visit. Okay, my paper, as my contribution to this panel, has an additional title, Digital Humanities in the Global University. And what I'm trying to do today in this paper is to problematize the concept of the digital humanities, as if it weren't problematic already, one might say. But on the one hand, it is true that the digital humanities, the concept of the digital humanities and the field or the group of fields that go under the name of digital humanities are becoming increasingly popular today. But digital humanities are considered cutting edge, at least to the extent that the humanities can be cutting edge. And they are attracting quite a lot of attention and sometimes even funding. On the other hand, it seems to me that by becoming increasingly stabilized, the digital humanities run the risk of becoming part of a certain discourse around the university and around higher education and the funding of higher education, and that this very stabilization of the digital humanities should be of concern for those of us, for those scholars who consider themselves to be involved in the digital humanities. In other words, we have seen that there is still some openness in the concept of the digital humanities. And there is an ongoing debate around the boundaries and the agenda of the digital humanities. So what I want to suggest today is that the debate on the definition of the digital humanities is a meaningful place to start reflecting on the concept of what counts as academic knowledge in the digital humanities, surely, but also perhaps in the broader context of the university as an increasingly globalized institution. So let me begin by spending a few words on the idea of the global university, an idea that is also becoming increasingly popular with all of us. And to give just one example, while introducing this recent collection of essays entitled Universities in Translation, Brett Barry points out how in the last 2 decades, the university has undergone a process variously described as, and I quote, one of scalar transformation, of renewal and reform, of crisis and of precarity, end of quote. And he writes also this, and I'm quoting again, globalization of economic and cultural life, irreversible in the waning years of the 20th century, has seemingly thrown the university, whose provenance has been so powerfully national, into disequilibrium. So today, the discourse around the university, and importantly around the future of the university, has become a global discourse. And such a discourse bears the mark of the inevitable time-space compression of neoliberal economy, with its tenet that, and I'm using David Harvey's soft quote and formulation, and I quote, "The social good is maximized by maximizing the reach and frequency of marketing transactions," end quote. Such a maximization, in turn, relies heavily on information and communication technologies, that is, on digital technologies. Now, what seems interesting to me is that the digital humanities as a field defines itself precisely as the humanities in dialogue with digital technologies. So the humanities in dialogue, in conversation with the kind of technologies that make globalization and the global university possible. It must also be noticed that the reflection on the humanities has always been a big part of the reflection on the university as such. And I'm sure I'm mentioning scholars we all know about. And again, to give a few examples, it was with the expression the humanities that in his famous work of 1996 entitled The University in Ruins, Bill Ratings rephrased Kant's idea of the conflict of the faculties. And so he reframed the whole reflection on the modern university as a knowledge-producing organization. And it was with the term the new humanities that Jacques Derrida started his reflection on the university to come as a site for questioning, asserting, professing, and saying anything, and I quote, without condition. And I'm quoting from Derrida's The University Without Condition here. So the digital humanities appear to be connected on the one hand to the reflection on the university as an institution and on what counts as academic knowledge. And on the other hand, to the digital technologies that make globalization possible. And it defines itself as the site of an encounter and a dialogue between these two realms. So the question I want to ask at this point is, what kind of interaction, what kind of dialogue is this? What kind of conversation between the humanities and digital technologies do the digital humanities make possible? And to begin answering this question, since I've said that the digital humanities are increasingly popular, let me look at one popular definition of the digital humanities. Yes, Wikipedia. Now, this definition says the digital humanities, sometimes also known as humanities computing, is a field of study, research, teaching, and invention concerned with the intersection of computing and the disciplines of the humanities. It is methodological by nature and interdisciplinary scope. It involves investigation, analysis, synthesis, and presentation of information in electronic form. Now, I'm not going to read all this quote, but it's quite clear that from this description, which reflects a generalized, I would even say a mainstream, perhaps, understanding of the digital humanities, in the digital humanities, the concepts and methods of computer science are applied to the analysis of texts. It's either literary texts or media texts. So we need to think broadly here. We need to think, for example, we need to encompass also, for example, what Lev Manovich calls cultural analytics, so a lot of data mining, data visualization, also on media texts. Okay, so on the other hand, I'm going to quote here the postscript of a recent issue of Culture Machine, a peer-reviewed online journal, which I've edited recently, devoted to the digital humanities beyond computing. And this postscript was written by Gary Hall, and he asks a very legitimate question. He writes, yet, just as interesting as what computer science has to offer the humanities is the question of what the humanities, in both their digital and traditional guises, assuming they can be distinguished in this way, which is by no means certain, what the humanities have to offer computer science, and beyond that, what the humanities themselves can bring to the understanding of computing and the shaping of the digital. Do the humanities really need to draw quite so heavily on computer science to develop a sense of their identity and role in an era of digital media technology? Along with a computational turn in the humanities, might we not also benefit from more of a humanities turn in our understanding of the computational and the digital? So what Gary Hall is asking is, what can the humanities tell us about digital technologies? Now, I want to begin answering this question by putting forward the following proposition. In their dialogue with computing, the digital humanities must encompass the study of digital technologies themselves, and particularly of software. And I'm provisionally conflating the concept of software and the concept of digital technologies, which we can talk about that later. But, okay, so this might sound like a lame claim. All right, we want to do the digital humanities, so we need to understand more about software. Fair enough. Except that what I mean here is a quite specific understanding of software and the digital. Not an understanding of software in order to use it. As in, I am using this software to analyze this text, I am using this algorithm to visualize this data. Not an instrumental understanding of software, and broadly speaking of the digital. What I'm arguing for is a more radical engagement of the digital technologies, of the digital humanities with digital technologies, in order to understand the digital from a point of view that is not the point of view of the user. It's not just a functional, instrumental, technical understanding. So I think that the digital humanities should ask of software the question, how does this work? But not in a purely technical sense. And what would a non-technical understanding of the digital look like? What I'm suggesting here is that digital humanities should engage in a radical rethinking of what the digital technologies are, and even of what technology is, and of what technology actually does to the human, to our concept of the human. So the digital humanities should not miss out on the opportunity to rethink technology, not just as a tool. Now, to say this, I am drawing on a body of work that is commonly referred to as the thought on originary technicity. I'm drawing basically on the French philosopher Bernard Stiegler, but also on Jacques Derrida and other philosophers. So let me explain this point further. In the first volume of Techniques and Time, his book of 1998, Stiegler writes that Western philosophy has always found it rather difficult to think about technology. And he points out that while the extraordinary technological changes of our age need to be conceptualized and made intelligible as soon as possible, in attempting to achieve the intelligibility, one cannot rely on any available account of technology in the Western philosophical tradition. And he writes this, and I quote, "At its very origin and up until now, philosophy has repressed techniques as an object of thought. Techniques is the unthought." Stiegler is pointing out that philosophical reflection has traditionally pushed technology to its own margins. And to explain briefly this point, from the very beginning, Western philosophy has distinguished itself from technology and has in fact identified itself as non-technology. And it has done so by separating techne and episteme. Episteme is the Greek word most often translated as knowledge, while techne is translated as either craft or art. And this separation between techne and episteme was rooted in the political arena of the 5th century Athens, and it associated techne with the rhetorical skills of the sophists. The sophists were, as we all know, professional rhetoricians, and they were skilled in the construction of political arguments. And their skillfulness, their techne, was perceived as indifference to establishing truth, or even worse, as an attempt to make truth instrumental to power. As such, sophists' techne came to be opposed to true knowledge. So truth remained the only object of episteme, which in turn was identified with philosophy. So this was a substantially political move, which deprived technical knowledge of any value. And Stiegler emphasizes how the subsequent step in the devaluation of technology was made by Aristotle through his definition of a technical being as a being that does not have an end in itself, and that is just a tool used by someone else for their ends. So, in other words, the exclusion of technology from philosophy has been founded on the concept of instrumentality. Technical knowledge has been interpreted as instrumental and therefore as non-philosophy. And I will quote Tim Clark for a moment. In his book of 2000, he writes that the conception of technology that has dominated Western thought for almost 3,000 years can be synthesized as follows, and I'm reading the quote. The traditional Aristotelian view is that technology is extrinsic to human nature as a tool which is used to bring about certain ends. Technology is applied science, an instrument of knowledge. The inverse of this conception, now commonly heard, is that the instrument has taken control of its maker, the creation control of its creator, Frankenstein's monster. So we have basically an instrumental understanding of technology here with also the horrifying scenario of technology escaping control. Now, in Techniques and Time, Stigler identifies a few exceptions to this philosophical refusal to openly approach technology, which coincide with the alternative tradition of thought on technology that starts with Martin Heidegger and encompasses André Leroi-Gourhan, this French anthropologist, and then Jacques Derrida and other philosophers. And this concept is not, and this tradition of thought on technology is not based on the concept of instrumentality. And this is the tradition of originary technicity, a term that Clark uses and that he borrowed from Richard Bearsworth. So let me spend just a few words on the idea of originary technicity. The term originary technicity has a paradoxical sound, but only, again, if we remain situated within the instrumental conceptualization of technology. If technology were instrumental, it could not be originary. It could not be constitutive of the human. So the concept of originary technicity resists the utilitarian conception of technology. To clarify the meaning of originary technicity, let me use the example that Tim Clark uses in that book. And he refers to a novel published in 1992 entitled The Turing Option, which was co-authored by Marvin Minsky, who is a leading theorist in artificial intelligence. And in The Turing Option, the protagonist, Brian Delaney, is involved in a shooting accident which damages his brain. And in order to regain his cognitive capabilities, he has a small computer implanted into his skull as a prosthesis. So after the surgery, he starts reconstructing the knowledge he had before the shooting. And the novel shows him trying to catch up with himself, literally, using notes, his former notes, and getting this increasing feeling that the self that wrote those notes in the past is lost forever. So Clark uses this story as a brilliant figuration of the fact that no self-consciousness can be reached without technology. And Clark writes that Delaney's experience, and I'm quoting again, is only different in degree from the normal working of the mind from minute to minute. No thinking, no interiority of the psyche can be conceived apart from techniques in the guise of systems of science, which it may seem to employ, but which are a condition of its own identity. End of quote. So, and of course it's very important to notice here that this is a very intimate understanding of technology. It's an understanding of technology that has nothing to do with building bridges or railroads. It has more to do with It has all to do with language and writing and memory. So the thought of originary technicity is basically a critical re-evaluation of Western philosophy that shows how the concept of technology has always been tightly connected to the concepts of knowledge, language, and humanity. So to recap, what I'm suggesting here is that the digital humanities could and should be informed by an understanding of digital technologies and of technology in general, perhaps, as more than instrumental, as constitutive of the very idea of the human. And such a study of technology would go beyond the idea of using digital technology in the humanities instrumentally. simply because the model or the models of rationality on which digital technologies are based cannot be imported unquestioningly into the humanities. On the contrary, what I'm suggesting is that the digital humanities should think digitality in a critical way. First of all, by questioning the assumptions of rationality which are at the foundation of digitality, including the very idea of instrumentality and of technology as a tool. And indeed, it seems to me that digital humanities are an ideal place to investigate this mutual constitution of technology and the human. The originary connection between technology and language places technology at the very core, not just of digital humanities, but of the humanities. And such an ongoing investigation would keep the very definition of the digital humanities open in a constant process of self-reflection. And just one word to conclude. I'm realizing that this paper is turning more and more into a manifesto for the self-reflexive digital humanities. But there it is. To go back to Gary Hall, in his book of 2002, Culture in Bits, he pointed out how cultural studies, and I'm talking about the British conception of cultural studies, were the ideal starting point for a study of digital technologies, precisely because cultural studies as an open and unfixed identity as a field. A critical attitude toward the concept of disciplinarity has characterized cultural studies from the start. That's what Hall observed. What I'm arguing now is that the digital humanities could also have a similar attitude toward its own disciplinarity and its own academic institutionalization. Digital humanities should pursue a deep self-reflexivity in order to keep its own commitments open. And by doing so, the digital humanities would remain acutely aware of the influence that the university as a political and institutional structure exercises on the production of knowledge, namely by constituting and regulating the competencies and practices of the humanities practitioners, and especially of the digital humanities practitioners, and especially in a globalized context that relies so much on digital technologies. And it is precisely in this awareness that the political significance of the digital humanities resides. Thank you.
I should like to start by thanking the organizers for this invitation, which, well, I'm honored and pleased to be here in this panel. And, well, I shall deal with this task of defining the digital humanities from a different angle from Dan and Federica, just from the point of view of an individual practitioner, since well, it's now about 20 or even more years. And how did it started in my experience, this involvement with digital humanities? As it was mentioned, I taught medieval philosophy in Bologna, and so we had the project of editing manuscript text, and we thought, well, we might just use the computer to save time and do it more quickly. But we then realized that using computers we could do something which we couldn't have done without, and we were doing things in a different way than we were used to. So realizing this interaction between our own disciplinary methodology and the use of computer was what involved us in this business. And actually, and so I shall start from, no, well, it's not the beginning. It's here, probably. No? What is, okay. And again. Oh, 5. Okay, thanks. Yes, it was. I can also start from this. It was when we began the time of standalone PCs and workstation. And people who knew about things, there were people used to work on mainframes, and the web had yet to come. And so it was a very different scene. But the definition we took for was more or less this, well, applied computer science. So computer science, representing information and processing information. And what I would like to insist is that you represent in order to process, not just to represent. And this was something which was there in our frame of mind. And so how do we, and this definition, you can find it in this, well, this was a result of a European thematic network program funded by the European Community. It was, the acronym means Advanced Computing in the Humanities. And so it was a kind of survey. And actually, for a better phrasing of that definition, in chapter 2, you find this, and the author is Manfred Thaler, who was an historian, practicing humanities computing for in mainframes, and then at that time, and we got in touch with Manfred Thaler. So his basic contention was that, as also Federica was mentioning, there are different levels of computer literacy or humanities computer literacy, for that matter. For instance, there is a use of well, applications which are not specific to humanities computing. There is the use of specific applications, application developed specifically for humanities computing research. But then there was what Thaler was calling a higher level, who's designing these applications. So somebody trained in what he was calling humanities information science. Something combining expertise from the humanities on the one side, and something from the computing side as well, because finding the adequate data structures to represent the information the humanists deal with, it's not an easy task. It's much more complicated than data structures used by computer scientists themselves. But anyway, and so for the methodology. So there were two, my own experience, 2 points. For instance, we were concerned one of Manfred's contentions at that time, historians were working with quantitative methods, statistical methodology, and for instance, census data or things of that kind. And then what did they do with this data produced by research, stored in an archive? So he had this idea of publishing data. So a database as an edition. And he developed a database management system just to publish documents, structured documents, as a database. So that meant, and we just did the opposite, thinking of an edition as a database, and the notion of processing textual content, and I completely agree with Federica. Well, I am a textual scholar, but the same applies not only strictly to text in a literary sense, but to the history of art. Text is the work of art, in cinema. Text is a film. So the same approach applies to multimedia, not to text in a strict sense. And for instance, I would like to insist on the idea of transcription. Well, there was a project in Princeton at that time, Les Chevaliers de la Charrette. They were trying to publish text of the troubadour tradition, and there was a point which didn't convince me. They were trying to mimic with special characters the glyphs of the manuscript. I said, well, that's odd, because the purpose of transcription for me is to processing. I have to transcribe in a way such as the computer would understand it. And so, no, I wanted to insist on this point, because there is something which has gone lost from this. For instance, in this move from mainframes to standalone computers and to the web. So computational processing was the main concern at the beginning. Then in the late 80s, I remember, or early 90s, markup became, for textual scholars, well, the adoption of SGML and then XML, the text encoding initiative, but what was that? Now we have tons and tons of TEI encoded data, and who processes them? Well, that's and then on the web, there was an emphasis on visualization. Well, visualization is a kind of processing, but it's not processing the information content. It's your brain still processing it. So, for instance, and this concern has been voiced by Marilyn Deegan. Marilyn Deegan has been, until last year, the editor of the Literary Linguistic Computing Journal, one of the, and Kathleen Sutherland. This book, published recently, Transferred Illusions. So, what new anxiety? They speak about new anxiety. I would like to read this quotation from Deegan and Sutherland. Could the instantaneous access of information, the machine processing of text, and the kind of visual stimuli and screen absorption that substitute for reading? Well, I may recall something recently. There was a presentation of textbooks for high school, and a student was saying, well, we like textbook with underlining, graphs and things, and so when we are in front of a white page, white page. A normal text page for him was a white page. So substitute for reading in the digital space could jeopardize the reading brain's precious reflective function. It's a reference to an important book. Anyway, so it's a kind of paradox. And is there a way out? I just reflecting on this move from standalone and web computing, from Gopher to links. And then, well, you may take it as a, I call it a serendipitous metaphor because out of it may come a solution and a confirmation of the definition I started with. So Gopher was a protocol for internet server, for FTP servers before a predecessor of the web. And links was a text-based web browser. You pressed on the command line a number and you would activate a link. So the web, again, visualization was not there anyway. So this might seem an allusion to the transition from standalone to web computing, but Gopher was from go far or go for, and links, homophone of links. But why did they use a metaphor of this kind? So it's a biological metaphor. It is astonishing how much from biology works in the humanities. For instance, Peter Robinson has studied the application of cladistic techniques developed by biologists to solve schematics problem in philology, and they work. They do work. And so the idea is that there is a biological, looking at digital humanities from an evolutionary point of view, I wanted. So, and what matters, it's not just the external look, but what these representative of the evolution of the species could do. So what's now I shall briefly mention some statement. There was a moment in which representation of textual data, for instance, was the basic concern. And this reminds me, for humanities computing, knowledge representation is a compelling and a productive way of doing humanities research. And in many ways, it is what humanities computing has been doing. He wrote another interesting paper comparing statements taken from an artificial intelligence paper by Davis and others, and all the things that were applying to knowledge representation in artificial intelligence, from an artificial intelligence point of view, John found parallels in the practice of digital humanities. And I wanted to stress that there is not only modeling, there is, or representation of information, but efficient computation. And so he himself wrote a paper, and in the title you find beyond representation. We have spent a generation furiously building digital libraries, repositories, and I'm sure that we'll now be building tools to use. So we are going back to computing and to processing in a way. And for instance, this Van der Broughton from library science and information science, knowledge organization, she mentions current cooperative work with scholars in the areas of humanities computing. And what's the point of convergence? Subject representation. So a representation of the information content. In the age of markup, heydays, what was content? PC data, parsed character data. That's representation, that's not content. Unless I understand content more in a semantic sense than in a pure string of characters without reference to what they really convey as an information content. So, an answer to the new anxiety, what now are called semantic digital libraries. So, digital libraries on one side, tagging communities of users, and semantic web. So there is a convergence to semantic description and representation. And here you can see in this linked open data development a kind of exponential explosion. It's something like at the beginning of the web. And well, that's the end of it, and we'll see in the future more of you, more than I will, shall see the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to invite our speakers to join in with Ted and the audience to ask your questions. I am sure they will be delighted to take them. Please remember that. Thank you very much. Can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Karen Green. I'm a librarian in Butler Library here. I was struck, Dr. Cohen, by your example of the decline in the word Christian in book titles indicating a decline in religious literature, which seems like a decontextualized result. There could be many, many reasons for that decline other than a decline in religious literature. There could be a rise in pamphlets. There could be a decline in Christian being used in a non-religious context, say a political context. There could be a rise in other terms being used. And so I'm wondering, given especially the quote from Gary Hall that you used, Dr. Frabetti, and the quote from Deegan and Sutherland that you used as well, how are scholars now making sure that the students who come up using digital humanities are not allowing the search to become the result? How are we allowing, inducing students to allow the humanist, thoughtful humanist approach to the technology? And any one of you can answer that. Thank you.
Well, let me answer the very good criticism, which we completely agree with. I think there's critics of this, what is very much a bare computational approach, assume that somehow we're checking our brain at the door when we're creating these things. And frankly, I find it a little bit offensive that they think, I'm a traditionally trained intellectual historian. I ask exactly the same questions you're asking. But then to rule it out, just on the face of it, that it wouldn't be helpful to be able to find documents that you'd want to look at further, or to be able to explain things a bit better through these mechanisms, right? I mean, after all, we have a corpus now of every book printed in English in the UK in the 19th century. We didn't have that before. So I think the problem is everyone feels like that's the be-all and end-all, that we come up with some graph and we publish it in, some British studies journal. And that's just preposterous. I mean, no one is saying that we're going to do that. But I think the engagement of it, and what I was trying to get at was that, and I think this is also an answer to Federica as well, is that it's with our humanistic engagement with those tools to understand where the gaps are in them that I think we can begin to approach something like a back and forth with the technology. I wouldn't go so far as, and this is where I think we could have an interesting debate about it, I actually think we have something to learn from computer science. I mean, the center where I work, we have been for nearly 20 years trying to do the kinds of disruptive things that Federica is talking about. Our mission statement is actually to democratize history, by which we also talk about including other voices, including other methods, et cetera, opening it up, not making it just computational history that privileges charts or the people who've been only recorded in books. We're trying to expand the definition of those things. But having said that, I still think that there's, I don't think humanists have taken very seriously the challenge of a Google. And I, for instance, have my students read Peter Norvig, who is Google's director of research, and he's probably one of the most famous artificial intelligence scholars. And he's rather brutal, actually, in his intellectual assessment of, for instance, humanities scholars translating texts. He's got a whole segment where he gave a talk that I assigned in which he says, well, one approach to translation is you learn a lot about a language and you intellectually engage it and engage a poem and think about these things. Or you can be me, Peter Norvig, and you can just get the largest data set you've ever seen, which will involve so many texts, almost an incalculable number of texts that are exact translations that other people have done, right? Not just the United Nations corpus, which is UN translated texts or religious texts that have been translated. But you have the web, you have, and a lot of people don't realize this is a really important reason that Google wants to digitize all those books, is that there are books in the 15 million that they've digitized that are translations of each other. Once you reach a large enough data set, for Peter Norvig, and this is his philosophical challenge to all of us in the room, you asymptotically approach a perfect machine translation mechanism. It's brutally rational, right? In fact, Google's translation has become very good over the past few years by ingesting all this data, because they have all these bigrams, so you can take any two-word segment and they can show you all the different translations that are possible for that, and they can show you all the statistical analyses of why those things should or should not be translated. That is a pretty significant challenge, I think, to the ways that we've done humanities scholarship. And I think we should take it seriously. I don't think we can just drop in and say, these algorithms are completely rationalistic, we shouldn't listen to them at all. But I think we have to approach it in that, if they are wrong, what should we ship? And I think this is really critical. We actually have to ship tools and platforms, and I think CHNM is taking this approach. You actually have to provide a substitute that can layer in forms of interactivity where the scholar goes back and forth with the computer, with algorithmic methods, where the scholar understands what algorithmic methods do really well, very good at plucking out all the memos about Al-Qaeda in 8 years of the Clinton White House, but then understands that, we're not going to end up with a graph, that we're going to have to go back and forth with that data. So we're trying to find, I think probably all of us here are trying to find some middle way that involves the technology, but also tries to invest it with a certain kind of intellectual heft of humanities scholarship and interpretation. But I think the first step actually is we have to take pretty seriously what people like Norvig say. And we have to be able to understand those algorithms at their heart. What document classification does, what text binding does. If we don't understand that, then we can't begin to pick it apart.
I have an odd background. I was trained by IBM, and I know what a hexadecimal dump is, and I've done assembly language. I also worked on a computer newspaper, and I'm also in the humanities here, old guard humanities. I have a question for Professor Cohen. I was a little troubled by the anecdotal history as opposed to the analog history, as opposed to the more digital history. And I rather thought this was an old problem. And I think Professor Buzzetti will recognize, and he was alluding to it, the whole problem of cliometrics of the Annales school and the like, in which one group is going to say what's countable doesn't count, and the other group's going to say it does count. And so that's just a little bit of history. In the medical arena, this has become very, very practical because, and that's my other area, because practice guidelines, and there's a long, long history of all of this coming from England especially, and meta-analyses of discrete data from trials, combining clinical trials and coming up with a result, has occasioned guidelines which have economic and social import and may not apply to the given patient. So one has within medicine itself an art versus science ongoing problem. All right, now my question to all of you is what I didn't hear about, which interests me, which is obsolescence. And there have been terrible, terrible problems, as I'm sure you all know, in the computer industry, in the commercial side of it, in defining standards. The governmental military side has been less so because there are national bureaus of standards in the countries that make these government and non-commercial computers. So I wondered if we could have your thoughts on obsolescence.
Okay. I have to take it, don't I? Yeah. So I think obsolescence is a difficult problem. I think, sadly, I think one of the negatives of the digital humanities is that we have lost a lot along the way because code stops running, and that's highly problematic. And in fact, a lot of what I spend my day on, sadly, other than my email, is sustainability and these sorts of things. Increasingly, I mean, here is where listening to what's going on the open web, and I'm currently working on a book on this, I think is important. I think standards and interoperability are really critical in this area. So I think early on a lot of digital humanities projects were their own silos, right? They would create a digital collection, there'd be a search layer on top of it or a visualization layer on top of it, but you couldn't extract things out of that. And so when I spoke about it all too briefly, things like APIs, application programming interfaces, are something really critical where you can extract things. So Terra uses a bunch of international library standards, METS and MODS and Dublin Core and all these things that I could talk your ear off about. But all those things exist so that we can get things from one tool to the next. It's one of the reasons very invested in open source is that you're not locked into some kind of system. You can get databases and data out of that. TEI, other things that are XML based that are in some sense very easily transferred are really critical components of this. So there are ways, and I think linked data is another really interesting area in the semantic web, where the intent is that it's a bit more fail-safe because you're not relying on some collection holder to keep the stuff in a particular form running on a particular system. So I think there are techniques that we are in the process of producing that will satisfy those things. But it is juggling a lot of balls in the air. And I'm not a librarian. I don't play one on the web. Well, I do play one on the web. And I've had to I've been doing this for over a decade now, and I've really had to learn a lot about these sorts of things of bibliographic pieces that are hidden from you as an analog scholar, I suppose is the way to put it.
May I add?
Please.
Yeah. Just some remarks. I remember on this problem reading something work done by, I remember the acronym, but I couldn't solve it. It's NARA, NARA, the National Organization for Archives. So they had a problem of preserving, as Dan was mentioning, the records, all the documents of the Congress are produced in digital format from a certain point onwards. And so they found a kind of, well, at least it looked to me convincing, a kind of migrating the data into an interchange format like XML, and then try, because one basic decision which has to be taken, and there are arguments in favor of both alternatives in my opinion, is what do you want to preserve? Do you want to preserve the format of the original data, or do you want to preserve the performance, the functionalities of the original data? For historical research, the original format is also important, I think, whereas for other purposes, functionality can be more important. So it was just some information that I happened to know about this this problem.
I'm David Schiffman. I'm Director of Digital Publishing at the Yale University Press. And we're actually undertaking a scholarly archive in the humanities. I guess I kind of wanted to, and we're faced with an issue which I want to sort of lay out. There was a lot of discussion talking about here's, we've gone from the mainframe, which is the library, to people being able to do their own computation on a set of content, which is kind of digital humanities computation along digital structures. I guess what I'm kind of curious about is to what degree do you allow sort of the web to happen, and the web not necessarily meaning putting things on the web, but to allow the collaboration to happen. So I'll give you an example. One is, it's interesting to sort of take a corpus and look at how many times has the word sex been used, or Catholic been used, or Christian been used. It's another thing to sort of see what kind of research is being done on the data by others and how to build upon that. And we're talking about humanities also with one big umbrella, but history has, social history, it's history since the 1860s. You have all this census data and whatnot. It would be good to know, what do people do with the data sets? So one of the things, and economics, same thing, right? So the question I have is, to what degree do digital humanities provide, within the context of the data, the computational and manipulation tools that is then shareable across? Because it's not only looking at what people do to the data, but it's looking, the scientist or the humanitarian scholar becomes the subject themselves, because it's important to know what other people are looking at and what they're doing and what they've done. And there's nothing that I've seen that's going on in that space, but I think that's where you go from the mainframe to the workstation to the web.
So here's one of the things that I was talking about, learning on the job, not in the armchair, that I think is really critical for the digital humanities, and that is that scholars have uses for archives that archivists can't anticipate. And I think this is a really critical principle, that learning on the... Right. Okay, right. So here's an example. So the September 11th collection that we host, we put it up as historians, social, cultural historians. We assumed people would use it for memorialization, for writing in the future social and cultural history of 9/11. When Roy and I were writing our book on digital history, we did a survey of the logs, the server logs, and we looked carefully at what people actually did with the collection. And to our astonishment, there were all these uses in many different fields that we hadn't anticipated. There were a bunch of linguists who used the collection to study teen slang. Some of the first examples of OMG are in the September 11th Digital Archive. Just made it into the OED. So there were people who were just studying teen slang, because we have about 10,000 stories by teenagers of what they experienced on 9/11. That could only happen because it's an open archive, which publishers have a problem on because they want to gate things to make money off of them. So it only happened because it was open. It was available on the open web, and people could access it with their own computational tools without our overlay. Similarly, people have studied the use of cell phones. Cell phone use, about 25% of our stories involve cell phone use. This is one of the early cases of that. So you just can't anticipate these things. And I think that is where this is what the web does well, and this notion of linking things. the whole principle of the web is that the intelligence is at the fringes, right? That people bring their own tools to a collection, or they combine collections together. And you simply can't anticipate that. So I think just from a pragmatic standpoint, that argues for open access, right? Even beyond just the ethical parts of it, of providing content to everyone globally. I think for scholarship, you have to provide it in an open way, and you have to provide it in a way that is not pre-cooked. So we provide a lot of our stuff in a raw fashion, right? Raw versus cooked, raw data, and that can be manipulated by anyone who wants to come by, and however they want to do it. But it's a tough problem for publishers, I think. It's a bind.
Can I also answer? I think this is a very interesting question. Since I'm arguing for a self-reflexive digital humanities, it's a very, very interesting point you made. And in general, it seems to me like we are all talking about this concept of the archive. And so the foundational value that the archive has in the construction of the concept of disciplinarity, because it's all about decisions, about things we leave out of the archive and things we include in the archive and what we do with these things. And I just wanted to mention that there's this open access database, C-Search, in the UK about cultural studies, which in a way makes quite obvious. It's an open database, but it's still, there is still some kind of peer review going on. So you can upload stuff on C-Search, but you cannot upload anything. I won't spend a long time describing this, but the point is that C-Search makes obvious that there are always decisions made whenever you decide what can be in the archive and what counts as a legitimate production of knowledge in a scholarly environment. Because again, you say it's very interesting to analyze what scholars do with digitized texts, but then, you know, you have to go a step beyond probably or farther and think who decides what counts as scholarly work, who is a scholar, and what is the software going to count, what kind of elaboration is it going to analyze. What if somebody who was not in an institution does something interesting with that text, and it could still be considered scholarly work in a way? So what kind of access and work are you analyzing and are you counting? And what counts as open at this point? Which is also a kind of interesting question that needs a lot of discussion. Yeah, and it also brings in the problem of standards and the idea again of what counts as a good standard in what discipline. So, yeah.
Well, there is also one aspect that I was mentioning before, the stage of standalone computing. The idea of a workstation there, standalone, was to have all the application and tools all in one single machine. Now you have application as web services, and for instance, in the field of digital critical editions, the amount of work you have to do to produce a high standard critical edition is so high that you cannot do it without collaboration and collaborative environment. So the old days of the individual scholar who would go into the archive and privatize his access to the archive. One of the key words of Manfred Thaler in doing is, at a certain point, he went into huge mass digitization projects. Just the idea was put the archive on your desktop so that it was everybody could check your results and not go back to the archive and rely on your research results. Now, there is, for instance, a project funded by the European Union, which is called Interedition, to build tools for producing digital edition, for transcribing, for collating, and for as modular application as web service, and the protocols for the exchange, because there might be somebody having done a transcription of a certain manuscript which can be of use to another scholar. So this kind of thing they developed in the web. And I think that's well, a substantial step forward for research in general.
You know, when I hear some of the terms like obsolescence and standards, obsolescence for me, I think of not just digital technologies, but certainly languages that die because of lack of use, or civilizations that fall in the loss of knowledge. And when we think about standards, we can think about, you know, the challenges we've had, again, pre-technology. It appears to me that it is history and humanities that is perhaps best suited to tie these very short trends in technology, which, if you go back to Babbage, it's only 150 years or so, to a much larger context of how technology or how civilization has been affected by these technologies, which digital just happens to be the one of the last 60 years. And perhaps that is the perspective that might be helpful for those of us in the technology sector to gain the wisdom that we need to build systems that could, let's say, outlast the 5 or 10 years that they currently last.
Great point. Yeah, and I think this is where, as historians, you know, participating in archive making is something I think that historians should be doing, because then we're participating in this. What should we be saving, right? That used to be defaulted to other people. And I think one of the wonderful things about collaborations in digital humanities is we actually actively engage, you know, what should we be saving? What should we be making available? So, and much in the past, as a Victorianist, I know this all too well. For instance, you know, we have things that are just, we have because of neglect, right? Preservation by neglect, as librarians like to call it. Things that just happen to be put in a box in someone's attic and then are refound. And enormous amounts of history have been written on that. The tower at the Cambridge University Library, which was, you know, often rumored to be filled with pornography, but it turns out the librarians were just putting genre fiction there, spy novels and things like that from the late Victorian era and the Edwardian period. All this junk, you know, that shouldn't be in the regular library was all stuffed in the tower. Now there are dissertations and books written about all this wonderful sort of throwaway fiction, but that was just preservation by neglect. So I think what digital humanities does is it tells you, like you were saying, wait a second, this is just a new era, and we can be proactive about saying we need to capture this particular material and making it available in ways that are useful.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a very interesting question again. And this is why I think that the study of software is very interesting for the digital humanities. And I have in mind the kind of field that now, and it's also an emerging field, goes under the name of software studies or code studies or even critical code studies. There's lots of scholars working on that, from backgrounds that go from media theory to the theory of technology to digital media studies. And the whole idea that people with a background in either critical theory or literature or any kind of textual analysis should and could read code or software programs in a different way, in a non-technical way, in a different way, either in a socio-cultural way, finding out presuppositions behind the writing of code. And there are lots of people doing this kind of readings from very different perspectives. And personally, as a person who has worked in software for many years, I think that absolutely all these ideas about software engineers are all very aware of all the problems in standardization, obsolescence, the unexpected consequences of technology. Something that software engineering, for example, was born in the 1960s to control the unexpected consequences of software. And in a way, we never managed to control that completely, but that's the way that software is written, in a way. So these aspects of technology, the fact that technology entails some kind of unexpected consequences all the time, can be approached from what I would call a background in the humanities. And the other point is that software studies, as it is done now in the States and in Europe also, tends to look at software as a cultural object. So the idea that software is something that we don't really understand because it's very technical, it's kind of very esoteric and exotic, and it becomes meaningful. That's Lev Manovich's, for example, approach. It becomes meaningful when we look at the cultural practices around software. So either we look at what people who write software do, or we look at the open access movement. But in a way, software is something that has to be made meaningful through cultural practices. And I would also say, yes, that's fine, but probably, maybe, people with a literary background or a cultural studies background or a media background should also look at code in itself, should be able to read technical texts in a way that is non-functional again. But we need to understand again the presuppositions through which code works. So the presuppositions in Google, for example, and the kind of decision that Google makes in the data that it presents to us, and what's behind those decisions, and even subtler decisions about why in the world did computer scientists come up with the idea of language, as in programming language. Why didn't they come up with a different thing that wasn't a language? Something visual or something. So what's behind the whole process of digitization? Why our civilization produced the idea of digitization in the first place? And that's something that is very, very well addressed with a, well, philosophical and humanities background in a way. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but...
About software development, there is also one thing which should be, humanists should be wary of in particular. You were talking about not putting computer science into humanities, but putting humanities into computer science. For instance, well, for a kind of personal concern, but there are technologies which impose themselves just because they are mainstream technologies. For instance, now in the semantic web, everybody is working on one very, from my point of view, way of semantic annotation or representation was, for instance, topic maps. Topic maps have been put aside from the mainstream development of ontologies and so on. So, from a humanistic point of view, I think there should be some, and especially from practitioners of humanities computing, attention to this phenomenon, because sometimes mainstream results are not completely suitable to the research concerns you have in analyzing data in a certain kind. And for instance, in the diagram I've shown about semantic digital libraries, there were three different agents. There were libraries, there were communities, there were semantic web. So humanities computing community should interact also in orientating or influencing the software development as a whole. That's at least a concern I have in a way, as a researcher in the field, because sometimes at the beginning commercial software wouldn't do for our needs, and what's happened now, it's something similar.
I'd like to follow up on Deegan and Sutherland. Has digital technology rendered reflective thinking obsolete? And have we lost out on the potential reflective thinking of a generation of humanist scholars?
Is that for...
Do you want to...
No.
Well, it's a very interesting question. I'm not sure I've got an answer, but I've got a few thoughts. I don't think that the digital technologies have any critical potential in themselves. I don't think that humanities have any critical potential in themselves. I think it's possible to think critically about both. And I would, personally, I don't know if we have lost out in any possible way on the possibility of thinking critically. What your question reminds me a lot is the whole debate about, for example, close reading and distant reading, and the idea that now that we have lots of digital data, it's necessary for us to use digital technologies because there is no way you can read all the Victorian novels of a certain kind, and so you need some kind of data mining or algorithm that does some analysis. And then the objection to this is, okay, but then how do you do you lose out on the possibility of doing a close reading, as in a critical reading? And there is a whole debate around the digital humanities, I think, about the idea of criticality. And do we renounce criticality in the digital humanities in order to produce deliverables, to produce software that, some kind of number crunching software that takes text as an input? So I think the digital humanities in a way puts into question, or should put, it does put into question the whole idea of what's critical thought, what counts as critical thought. And for me, in order to do critical thought in the digital humanities, we need to think critically about the digital in the first place and its assumptions. So the idea of rationality that is behind the digital and writing software. So my own take on this is a deconstructive approach. And I know this word is not very popular in the academy anymore, but I take it as a way to work with the conceptual system behind software and that sustains software, using it while at the same time stepping out of its limitations and looking at its limitations. So my idea is that, of course, we don't have to stop the experimenting with the digital. And again, it's Catherine Hale's take and Lev Manovich's take is that we have this number crunching software. Let it run. Let it see what it does, because it might have some very interesting outcomes that we haven't anticipated, which is fine. But then again, this is only one possibility for the digital humanities. And then we need to think about the assumptions behind that software at the same time. And it's not like the humanities don't have their own assumptions. I mean, the very concept of the author, which has been put under question in the last few decades, is still very much alive in a way. And it's all about, for scholars, the concept of authorship is still very much important. So it's not like the humanities have a critical potential that the digital doesn't have.
In my own experience, I can say that practicing digital humanities, the problem of representing text in a digital form, has made me think more than I used to. Well, I was taken for granted that I knew what text is. I've learned what text is just by practicing digital humanities. I can mention, for instance, an example of this critical reflection of the notion of text, Radiant Textuality by Jerome McGann. For instance, this parallel with biology. I was involved with a group of colleagues in Bologna. They have a bioinformatics center and so on. And so the number of approaches that there are in humanities computing, for instance, DNA analysis by biologists, they use techniques developed by markup scholars. So there are, they asked me for a paper. I was thinking of why does it work? So thinking of text as a physical device to carry information. And you realize that, for instance, system theories, theorists like Luhmann, for instance, only a biological organism like an individual or a social group is a system. But text itself, it works as a self-organizing system in a way. So there's a lot of stimuli of reflective thinking coming from the practice of digital computing, humanities computing, at least in my own experience. That's why it was fun more than getting results for me. Intellectual fun, not just producing a result, an edition, and what I gained more was actually this aspect of this practice. I don't know if it's a personal case, but at least that was for me.
Hi, my name is Suzanne Walsh, and I am an independent consultant here in New York with dual degrees in art history and library science, and I have a bit of a practical question, specifically directed towards Dan Cohen, is that I found it really interesting that you actually advised your students, your graduate students, to start a blog and to start blogging and put themselves out on the internet. And given that time is a very scarce resource for all of us, and given that it takes time to not only acquire the skills to successfully use technology, but also it takes time to keep your blog and your Twitter feed and to learn new technologies and learn about what's new, in what ways is your university or our universities in general, do you know of, incentivizing the innovative new use of knowledge and using these new kinds of technologies? Because otherwise, the time spent to, invest in these new technologies might not translate into a job later on, given that there are so few jobs available and the competition is so fierce to actually receive the jobs.
Right. So that's a small question. I think actually this is related to the last question. The way I like to put this is, I think something like blogging just provides another outlet. And I think one of the great misconceptions about the blog is that you have to be blogging every day. I don't know. I blog sometimes once every 3 months. If the spirit doesn't move me, I don't blog. But it's one potential outlet. I mean, I also write books, and I write code, and I do all these other things. But I think related to the last question, I try to look at the array of potential scholarly outlets for a particular idea or research project that I have going. In some cases, I only want to write 1,000 words, and I'll put that on a blog. In other cases, I want to write 100,000 words. And I think there's this misconception that, we've come to take your beloved monograph away, On the other hand, there is, I think, something healthy to having a wider array of outlets for your scholarship. I think one of the most interesting developments, if you're, I'm giving a talk tomorrow at NYU, you're welcome to do the 2-day Dan Cohen tour of New York, but I'll be talking about this more tomorrow downtown. But I think it's a very interesting development that probably the best-selling academic work this year will be Tyler Cowen, the economist's 15,000-word, $4 e-only book that went straight to Kindle and iPad. It is something that, he decided, well, I don't have more than 15,000 words to say. I think if he had taken it to a publisher, the book is called The Great Stagnation. If he had taken it to a publisher, they would have said, write another 50,000 words so we can sell this for $29.95 in hardback. But because he realized, we're in the age of the web, he decided, well, this is bigger than a blog post, and he actually runs a blog that's visited by 100,000 people a month. And, it's bigger than an article, but it was smaller than a monograph. He realized that there's a way to disseminate scholarship in a different format, and he decided to put it out in that way. And that's what I think a blog is that it can be a locus for additional work that kind of doesn't fit into these forms. It can use multimedia. It can link to other things, which is really underestimated, this fact of linking, and really the lack of it. And really footnotes don't quite do the same thing. The fact of instantly being able to go over to an archive, for instance, from a blog post and analyze something yourself is very powerful. So I think beyond that, actually, I think just the branding of it. honestly, if we're going to be ruthless about it, I don't think it's healthy that grad students are sort of known for one thing for 10 or 15 years of their life, which is their dissertation and then their book from the dissertation. I happen to think it'd be healthier for scholarship, and especially humanities scholars, who are supposed to be thinking about lots of things. I mean, are we just going to be an expert on one particular thing that your one book is on? Or would it be healthier to show a wide array of interests, some of which you do in long form, some of which you do in short form, and to have some place where when someone Googles your name, they can find all of that work, I think is, to me, a higher value. On the university side, I think universities are coming around on this. And I'll tell you, it's happening from the top down. You know, if you look at George Mason, for instance, you know, they know that the Center for History and New Media gets 16 million unique visitors a year to their web properties. It gets the university name out, it gets the research that we're doing out. And it's just, you know, from just a ruthlessly pragmatic standpoint, there is nothing bad about having a defined online presence that will reach many more people than you will in print.
Well, thank you very much. Our time is up. Thank you to our speakers, to the audience, to Kathleen Pope for putting together this session.